Talk Radio Europe, number one for news and talk.
Yes, and welcome back. Just to let you know, in about 5 or 6 minutes' time, we're going to be talking to the noted economist Jonathan Davis of Jonathan Davis Wealth Management. You've heard Jonathan on every news channel and TV channel in the UK regularly speaking about the economy, and he's got some very interesting things to say about the Irish bailout of AIB in Ireland, which of course is one of the leading news stories on the news today. So that's Jonathan Davis coming up in a few minutes. I'm going to take another piece of music. Okay, to more serious matters, and one of the big news stories today, or the biggest news story today I suppose, was the news that the Irish Central Bank has said it will need to increase the amount of support given to the country's banking sector. The total amount has risen to €45 billion, or 32% of the country's gross domestic product. The central bank said supporting the AIB, the Allied Irish Bank, alone would cost from €29.3 billion to a stress scenario bailout of up to €34 billion, which is about £29.2 billion sterling. Brian Lenihan, the finance minister from Ireland, he was the guy you saw on the news all day today. He said it is manageable. Without the bank support, the deficit will be 12%. Last month, though, the cost of the bailout was estimated at between 22 to 25 billion euros. Lenihan said today as well, he said the support was vital, he said, as the Anglo-Irish Bank was too big to fail. And this is a story that sent shockwaves around Europe as well as the Republic of Ireland. Joining me on the phone now from England, I think he's from London, I'll ask him in a second, is a man you know very well, the Managing Director of Jonathan Davis Wealth Management. He's a noted economist, and as I said earlier, you regularly see him on the BBC, Sky, Channel 4 and everywhere else that there's a telly or a radio. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good evening, Richie.
Lovely to talk to you. It is London. You are in London today, aren't you?
In fact, I'm talking to you from my home in Hertfordshire, just outside London.
Just outside London. Jonathan, this is not really news to you, is it?
Well, no. The system is bankrupt. Whether it's in Ireland or the rest of the Europe or the United Kingdom or America or Australia or Japan or China, you name it, the system is bankrupt. Globally, every country has allowed banks to massively overlend, and of course the people got into it. They bought into the nonsense that asset prices would only ever rise forever. Well, of course, there's no such thing as anything which rises forever, except in this case, misery, because that's what we have. You know, you talk about these gargantuan 45 billion euros and 2.5 billion euros to, you didn't mention it, but to the Irish nationwide and whatever.
That's right.
But what does it actually mean? It means that every single taxpayer in Ireland, 2 million of them, will pay 22,500 euros each. That's what it's going to cost them. And of course, that's just the size of the bailout. Never mind the reality of the massive losses that they're taking on their houses. And then add on to that the substantial rise in unemployment, the cut in salaries, public sector salaries that they're enduring in Ireland. I tell you, we have not seen the last of it, and it's already pretty severe.
It's worse. It seems to be worse in Ireland, though, Jonathan. You know, the percentages of the gross domestic product compared to that of the UK, which is substantially lower. Why is it so bad in Ireland? Well, there's 2 points there. First of all, it's bad in Ireland because they borrowed 844 billion euros all told, which is 5 times the size of their economy. So that's the reason why it's bad. And they paid for land and buildings, whether residential or commercial, which, as the Irish finance minister said in Northern Ireland today, he said these asset prices will never return. Well, they paid over the odds, Jonathan, didn't they? They paid over the odds as well. Contractors were paid over the odds. Workers were paid way over the odds. We were paying tradespeople in Ireland, carpenters, builders, sometimes 4, 5, 6 times the going rate in Europe for a carpenter.
And, I bring, many of your listeners will be from the United Kingdom as well. And I remember when we had the house price crash in the early 1990s, I remember distinctly reading that the tradesmen that you mentioned, they were earning at the end of the crash 20% on a daily rate what they had been earning at the top of the bubble. But, the other point you make is that Ireland seems particularly bad compared to other countries. Well, you see, that is an inaccurate perception because every country is in the mire. What I find fascinating, I saw a chart recently of the loans from one country to another country in Europe. In this particular instance, half of the 844 billion euros loaned to Ireland came from just Germany and the UK. But what's fascinating is if you think of a map of Europe, the UK lent to Ireland and Italy and Spain and Greece, and Germany did as well. But you know what? All these countries receiving money lent to other countries, and the other countries lent to other countries. In other words, the system, I'd go far as to say the system was crooked, in that the regulation was absolutely null and void. There wasn't any regulation, so the amount of lending has totally got out of sync with reality. And
Jonathan, a word on that. Why?
Every country is going to have massive problems because of this. Sorry
to interrupt you, Jonathan. Why did that lending get out of hand? Why were banks lending to institutions, to companies? I have nothing against banks. Banks have to loan to companies, otherwise the economy doesn't work.
Yeah.
But why were they giving out such high risk loans?
Yeah, because when it comes down to it, the bankers knew that they could get away with it. In the credit bubble, or I like to call it the debt bubble, leading up to about 2007, 2008, the banks made fortunes doing all these loans, and the individual bankers made fortunes. Since, of course, we've had the biggest economic and financial collapse in history, that is not an exaggeration.
No,
that is simply clear. And the banks have made phenomenal losses. Think about it, the individual bankers have still made personal fortunes. In other words, they could get away with it. The regulation was non-existent. The politicians, the bankers, the central bankers, I don't know how you put it, I'm not a literary guy, but as far as I'm concerned, they were all in cahoots. It served their purposes to allow all this lending. Look, you're in Spain. Let me give you a statistic. In 2006, at the height of the residential property bubble in Spain, you guys built more individual dwellings, 800,000 of them, more than Germany, Italy and France combined, because the banks were allowed to make these levels of lendings. The property developers borrowed and they flogged them to unsuspecting people who actually basically didn't. They bought into the dream, or what's turning out to be a nightmare.
That's right.
As I say, the asset prices could only ever rise, and of course there's no such thing.
No, there isn't. No, it is a disastrous situation in Spain.
Yep.
You know, it's like throwing a stone in a pond when you start to talk about financiers and banking and the collapse, because you have people out here now with apartments that aren't worth a quarter of what they paid for them.
Well, indeed, and
what they haven't paid for them, in fact, because they haven't paid for them because they're still paying a mortgage.
Well, exactly, and that is such a good point, because, you know, the language used, people talk about homeowners, and of course, if you're borrowing 80 or 90% of the value of a property, you're hardly a homeowner. What you are is a mortgage borrower. But everyone talks about home ownership, and of course, so many loans, as you know, were taken out on an interest-only basis, which meant that people haven't even started chipping away at the amount they owe. It's an absolute disaster, but you know, every country practically on earth is affected, and that's why the 10-year debt bubble will have 10 or 20 years to play itself out. I must give you the example of Japan. Come on, everyone knows that in up to the 1980s, Japan was about the greatest economic power on earth. It rose, this relatively small country, to being the second largest economic power on earth. What happened over the last 20 years? It's been in depression. Their property prices fell 75%. Their stock market fell 75%. They're still in depression. And it was as a result of a debt bubble, which was further fueled by the government printing money every few years. And fun enough, what are the governments doing now? Yeah. What are we talking about this evening? We're talking about the government's printing money. It is not the solution, it's the problem. We need to stop bailing out these banks. We need to stop bailing out the top 0.1% of wealthy individuals, because who's paying for it? You're a taxpayer, I'm a taxpayer, your listeners are taxpayers. We're all paying for it. And that's what the listeners need to get. They need to realise. These public sector cuts right across Europe, salary cuts, pension cuts, tax rises, all the money is going to the bankers.
It's going back to them.
It's as simple as that.
Jonathan, can you stay with me for a minute? I'm going to take a quick break here, if you don't mind, and we'll come right back to it then. We're speaking with Jonathan Davis, of course, of Jonathan Davis Management, a noted economist who we know very well from our TV and radios. I'm going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more with Jonathan after these messages.
You're with Talk Radio Europe for Costa del Sol East on 88.9.
And on Talk Radio Europe.
She catches me out every time on 902 444461 with Jonathan Davis, the noted economist, as I said earlier on, talking about not just what happened in Ireland and what's been happening in Ireland today, but what's happening in the world in general. Jonathan, welcome back.
Hi.
Look, I meet people on the street and they think it's all a big conspiracy. They say, you mentioned it before the break, they say they're printing money. Where's that money coming from? Where's that money valued? What's backing that money? The answer is nothing, really, is it?
There's nothing backing the money. This is where it gets slightly technical. However, many of your listeners will have heard at least of the gold standard, which we used to have in the developed countries up until about the 1930s. And what that basically meant was the gold bars that were in the vaults of the Bank of England or under Fort Knox in the United States. Basically, the banks, or the central bank, should I say, was allowed to create money based upon a multiple of how much they had in gold. But we in the UK got rid of the gold standard way back in the 1930s, and the United States got rid of it in the 1970s. And in other words, what that meant was there is absolutely nothing backing the creation of money. You put €1,000 deposit into a bank, it's allowed to lend, say, 950 of that euros to another bank. And you know what? That second bank can then lend 900 euros to another bank, and that other bank can then lend 850 euros. My point being, it's a literal fact that 1,000 euros can actually be the basis of something like 40,000 euros of lending. Now, you multiply that by all the houses and all the loans and all the deposits in the world, and that's why we have this astonishing situation that there is so much debt in society and held by governments, it'll mean that our currencies ultimately in the long term will be decimated, and I mean decimated. You'll see in relation to the only true currency, which is gold. Gold is the only true currency. It's the only thing which ultimately holds its value. The value of euros, sterling, dollars, yen, whatever, they will all be decimated against gold, which means that, in other words, if you ain't holding gold in your investment portfolio, over the next 10 years, your wealth is going to diminish greatly.
How can a country loan another country, I don't know, 100 million or 200 million, let's say, dollars? They're not loaning them anything then, are they?
The answer is at the push of a button. And listeners may be thinking, "Oh, this guy's crazy. He's exaggerating." Literally, that's how governments or banks lend money to another institution or an individual. The push of a button, and money is just created out of thin air. Google. Go on the internet and ask, where does money come from? And you'll see loads of articles and videos. Money literally comes from thin air when you have nothing backing it. And as I say, that's how we got into the situation where stupid loans could occur by the barrel full, because A, the bankers knew they'd get away with it, and B, they were allowed to lend and lend and lend on the same money in the first place. And that's why we have these gargantuan debts, which ultimately you and me and your listeners, we're going to be paying for it, because it's going to be higher taxes for years, it's going to be lower public sector spending for years, and asset prices, as far as I'm concerned, are going to fall for years. So, you wonder, people need to sort out the finances.
That's right. You wonder, Jonathan, if somebody was taken to court by a bank for defaulting on a loan. Banks, I don't know where banks take people to court. It's some defence, isn't it? Yeah, of course they do. Yeah, it's silly of me to say that. Of course, banks take people to court for non-payment.
Yeah.
It's what a wonderful defence it would be to say to a judge or a jury, well, they never gave me anything. Mm-hmm. To be honest.
Well,
what did they give me?
Well, wouldn't it just? I suspect it wouldn't.
Probably wouldn't hold up. No, because society would collapse.
I think it's fascinating that when you consider the practices by the merchant banks, I'm quite convinced. In fact, I know that many of the practices were outside of the spirit of the law. It's quite amazing that so few, and I'm talking about a handful of names, have been brought to book. And yet there are literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world involved in this system. And that just tells me, you talk about conspiracy. No, that's too strong. But certainly the system of regulation was non-existent. Thus, basically, the bankers and the politicians got away with not quite murder, but you know what I'm getting at.
Absolutely, yeah. Can you stay with us another couple of minutes? I'm just going to take a quick break here, and we'll come right back. Thanks, Jonathan. With Jonathan Davis. Fascinating stuff, this, by the way. And if you do want to make a comment on anything, 902 44 4461 or studio@talkradioeurope.com. Back with Jonathan Davis, of course, of Jonathan Davis Management, Wealth Management, talking about the state of the economy in Ireland and in particular the rest of the world. And it's scary stuff, Jonathan. The bankers, as you said earlier on, they don't pay for it. They continue to make money anyway. The man on the street is pulling his hair out and her hair out because they believe that, we now own so much of the banks now, so that's a good thing. But that's not strictly true either, is it?
Well, actually, we do own much of the share capital of the biggest banks.
I'm sorry, I should have qualified myself, Jonathan. You're quite right. What I really mean to say is we don't have much of a say in what happens.
Well, that's what's ridiculous. Why don't we? If we own them, why don't we? Again, as far as I can see, the bankers have stitched the politicians up. Yeah. The bankers are smarter than the politicians. So when the politicians said, we'll borrow this vast amount of money and bail you out, they didn't have to say, and these are the rules. The bankers got away with it yet again. It's incredible, but it's true.
When we were speaking earlier on, you gave me some advice. You were talking about portfolios and what people should do and what people should be looking at. If you want to share that with us again, what you were saying.
Well, sure. In general terms, I believe that we are in, unfortunately, a depression. When you consider that the first Great Depression of the 1930s was set off by a credit bubble of the late 1920s, and of course we've just had an even bigger, in proportionate terms, credit bubble. Thus, I believe we're in depression for many years. In a depression, it's likely that asset prices, that's houses, commercial property, stocks and shares, will continue to fall considerably. And of course, they started falling 2 or 3 years ago. Houses, everyone knows about. Commercial property, people understand as well, it's still on the way down. Stocks and shares, people think, oh, well, the stock market's risen for the last year, so it must be on the way back. Well, I happen to believe that we're just in a continuing downtrend, which started about 3 years ago, and the market will continue on that trend down for the next couple of years. Remember, no trend goes in a straight line. Otherwise, it would be called a straight line. It would be a trend,
that's right, it would be linear, yeah.
So on that basis, the major, what we call asset classes, stocks and shares, property, are on the way down. You need to consider what you should do to preserve, first of all, your capital. And cash is actually not bad, although the interest rate is very low. If, as we see, asset prices are falling, then hold your cash. Then in the future, you'll be able to buy the same assets for much lower prices. And that way, you'll make money over the long run. Once we get over this low inflation period, I mean 3 or 4% inflation, it might be higher than the interest rate you get in the bank, but it's still relatively low inflation. Once we get over this low inflation, I think what's going to happen is that the governments are going to print more and more money, and as I say, they're going to decimate their currencies. That's when inflation is going to come back big time, and I'm quite convinced by the end of the decade we're going to see 1970s style inflation in the UK. In the mid-1970s, we had 25% retail price index inflation. And I'm quite convinced that we're going to see 15, 20, 25% inflation by the end of this decade. Thus, you will find that asset prices will then rise. However, the price of food and clothes and fuel and electricity will rise even faster. In other words, the cost of living is going to soar. So over the next 5-10 years, I'm not talking about the next year or two when you should be only concerned about capital preservation, but over the next 5 or 10 years you need to be concerned about inflation. It's not going to happen in the next couple of years. Following that, though, you need to be concerned about inflation. You need to have a portfolio which in due course will be invested in the likes of gold and oil and indeed most stocks and shares, but that's in due course. For now, preserve your capital at all costs, because I believe you'll be able to buy the same assets back much cheaper in the next 12-24 months.
It's incredible, isn't it? Jonathan, I'd like to ask you to come back on the programme again, if you don't mind, in the future and talk about these issues and more. It's fascinating. I could have you on all night, to be honest with you. But I've got to leave it there, coming up for the news at 9 o'clock. Do you want to give out your website details?
Well, that's very kind. It's JonathanDavisWM.com. WM stands for Wealth Management.
And that's
JonathanDavisWM.com.
And that's Jonathan, Jonath. It's not Jhon, so it's Jon, isn't it?
It is indeed. I suspect if anyone Googles me, sort of Jonathan Davis, investment advisor, they'll probably
it's going to come up straight away, yeah.
Because as you say, I do a fair amount of media commentary.
Media work anyway. Thanks very much for taking the time out to talk to us this evening.
Very well.
Appreciate it, Jonathan. All the best, and we'll talk to you very soon. God bless.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Thank you.